The Hudson River Pier at the foot of Murray Street, New York City, a Thursday evening in June 1921, 20 minutes before 6. George Harrington, 41, a textile buyer from Boston, stood at the rail of the Priscilla with his wife Clara and their daughter Anne, 17, watching the dock crew cast off the last of the lines as the crowd from the gangway dispersed itself across the lower decks. George had made this crossing perhaps a dozen times in the past 10 years, always the Fall River line, always the evening departure from Pier 14, always the Priscilla if she was running rather than the Commonwealth, and he had never once, crossing from New York toward Boston, taken the train. Clara had asked him, the first time they made this trip together, why the boat when the train was faster. George had given the practical answer. The overnight crossing meant arriving in Boston at breakfast time without the cost of a New York hotel. That answer was accurate as far as it went. What it did not cover was the specific, unrepeatable quality of standing at this particular rail as Manhattan's roofline began to lose its detail against the evening sky, a view no train window on the New Haven line had ever offered, and could not, in its nature, offer at all. Anne, making her first overnight crossing as an adult, had already found the spot at the rail she intended to keep until the last of the city light failed. She had brought her sketchbook. George had said nothing about this. He understood exactly what she was planning to draw, because he had wanted to draw the same thing the first time his own father had brought him aboard a Fall River steamer 20 years earlier and had not had the sketchbook. What had George Harrington learned from his own father and from a dozen crossings of his own about what the Fall River line gave a passenger that the New Haven Railroad's overnight train to Boston, leaving at nearly the same hour and arriving at nearly the same time, genuinely could not? What the Harringtons boarded that Thursday evening was not simply a night boat. The Priscilla had been launched in 1893 as an all-steel 440-foot sidewheel steamer capable of running at 21 miles per hour, a speed that made the overnight Long Island Sound passage to Fall River genuinely competitive in elapsed time with the train. But speed was not what the Fall River line had built its reputation on. It had built its reputation on what the Priscilla and her running mate, the Commonwealth, offered a passenger who was already willing to travel overnight, the specific, documented amenities of a vessel that the line's own advertising accurately described as a mammoth floating palace steamer. The documentation is precise. The Commonwealth, the last and largest of the fleet at 456 feet when she entered service in 1908, carried 425 staterooms, a grand staircase, a dining saloon, a barbershop, a writing room, and a dance floor. The Priscilla carried more than 300 first-class staterooms plus 15 parlor suites. Both vessels required a crew of approximately 250 to operate. The main saloon of the Priscilla was furnished in the manner of a first-class hotel lobby. The grand dining room offered a la carte service under indirect electric lighting set in 3 ceiling domes. A passenger who boarded at Pier 14 in Manhattan at 6 in the evening could, without irony, have a haircut at the barbershop, send a letter from the writing room, eat dinner at a properly laid table with silver and white linen, and arrange to have a suit or evening gown sponged and pressed overnight, and return to the stateroom door before arrival. George Harrington had done all of these things on various crossings, and none of them was what he remembered about the trip. With the precision he remembered the first hour on deck as the city receded. What did a vessel built this deliberately? Floating palace, 250 crew, barbershop, orchestra, a la carte dining, overnight stateroom, actually require of a family like the Harringtons? And what did the specific choice of the boat over the train tell us about what George Harrington had truly brought his daughter aboard the Priscilla to experience? Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you've been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of the American excursion boat trip between 1900 and 1980. What the steamer, or the dayliner, or the coastal tour boat actually offered, what the crew and the regular passengers built into the trip over years of repetition, and what families were actually getting from 2 hours on the water that the destination on either end could not give them alone. Not nostalgia for an old photograph of a steamer. The documented social meaning of a trip that a generation of American families built into their summers on purpose. Even if you never sailed the Fall River Line, what it gave a passenger, an entire night of dinner, music, and open water that arrived you in New York, rested instead of exhausted, is something no highway, however fast, was ever built to provide. And if your family ever took an overnight steamboat between cities, put it in the comments. Did your family ever sail the Fall River Line, the Old Bay Line, or any Long Island Sound night boat? And do you remember waking up to find New York already outside the porthole? Next time on this channel, the Puget Sound Mosquito Fleet, the small boats that carried an entire Washington state region to work every morning until a single bridge ended it all. Back to the rail. By 8 o'clock, the Priscilla was well into Long Island Sound, and the lights of the Connecticut shore were a thin line of amber in the darkness to the north. Anne had given up on the sketchbook an hour earlier, not because there was nothing to draw, but because the specific quality of the light that remained after the city had gone was not light that a pencil could catch. What she could see from the rail was the dark water close under the hull, moving fast, the distant shore lights, and, occasionally, the outline of another vessel passing in the opposite direction, close enough that its own deck lights reflected briefly on the Sound before it disappeared. George and Clara had gone down to dinner. Anne had declined. This was not something she could have explained to her parents without it sounding ungrateful, but the specific appeal of the dinner table below, the silver, the linen, the orchestra playing in the saloon, was, in this particular hour, less compelling than the specific appeal of what was happening at the rail. The city had gone. The destination was not yet visible. There was nothing, for an hour on this deck, on this water, that required Anne Harrington to be anywhere other than exactly where she was standing. This was the specific thing the Fall River Line offered that no competing service between New York and Boston could replicate. Not the stateroom, not the dining saloon, not even the orchestra. It was this, a specific, protected interval of in-between, structured entirely by water and darkness, that no railroad timetable had ever managed to provide, because a railroad timetable, by definition, could not build in an hour where passengers were required to be somewhere that was neither here nor there. The boat could. The boat, simply by being on water, and by moving at a speed that kept the hour from feeling rushed, gave its passengers an interval that belonged to nothing except itself. What did it mean that the most memorable thing about an overnight crossing on the world's most lavishly equipped inland steamer was an hour on deck in the dark that cost nothing extra and required nothing at all? Anne went down to the stateroom after midnight, long after her parents. The Priscilla's staterooms were not large, but they were precisely what they needed to be: a bunk, a wash basin, a porthole, a small lamp. George had booked a first-class stateroom. This was the crossing he made for business, and the company paid, and the key that unlocked it had the Fall River Line's crest embossed on the bow, a small, specific detail that Anne would keep for decades without entirely knowing why. What the night gave was simple: 8 hours of the boat's specific rhythm, the vibration of the walking beam engine, the sounds the hull made on Long Island Sound when the weather was easy and the water relatively flat, the occasional bell from the pilot house that meant a turn in the channel or a course correction, all of it continuous and specific and entirely unlike any other sound a room had ever made around her. No hotel she would stay in the coming years would make these sounds. No train she would take from New York to Boston, lying flat in a Pullman car on the New Haven line, would make these sounds. No vehicle that ran on land could make these sounds, because no vehicle that ran on land was, at any point in its journey, on water. George Harrington had understood this, the way he understood most things about the Fall River line, not by thinking about it, but by having done it enough times that the specific rightness of it had simply become part of what a journey between Boston and New York meant. He had never once explained it to Clara. He had simply booked the boat every time and let the night explain itself. What did the stateroom on an overnight crossing actually provide? Not as luxury, but as the specific mechanism of a kind of rest that arriving by train, however comfortable, genuinely did not supply. The Priscilla made her landing at the Fall River Wharf at around 5 in the morning, and the Harringtons were already dressed when the bell rang. This was the specific discipline the Fall River line imposed on its passengers that a hotel checkout never did. The night had a fixed ending, and the fixed ending was a wharf at dawn rather than a front desk at 11. George found this preferable. A hotel checkout required a decision: stay one more night or go. A Fall River landing required nothing of the kind. The boat arrived at the wharf, the gangway went down, and Boston was 40 minutes away by the Old Colony Railroad connection that the line had built its entire schedule around. What the dawn landing at Fall River offered was a specific, well-documented transition moment that regular Fall River line passengers treated as its own small ritual. The harbor at first light, the smell of coffee from the dockside food vendors who set up specifically for the morning boat crowds, the line of passengers emerging from the saloon gangway in various states of readiness, and the Old Colony train on the adjacent platform that would have most of them in Boston's South Station before the city's working offices opened. Anne had slept perhaps 4 hours. She did not feel she had slept 4 hours. She felt, standing at the gangway in the gray early light, precisely as she had felt once before, waking up on the first morning of a school term when something she had been looking forward to was, for the first time, actually beginning. The feeling had nothing to do with Fall River, which she had not previously visited and would not remember in detail. It had everything to do with the specific, unhurried interval the previous night had provided, the interval between leaving one city and arriving in another, during which she had been required, by nothing more complicated than the boats being on water, to simply be on the boat. What did the Harringtons carry off the Priscilla at Fall River at 5 in the morning that the New Haven Railroad's overnight train to Boston, which delivered passengers to South Station at approximately the same hour, did not? Before you can fully understand what made the Fall River line the preferred route between New York and Boston for nearly a century, you need to understand the specific social world it managed to carry on a single overnight crossing. The Fall River line's documented passenger list across its history included U.S. presidents, Grant, Harrison, Cleveland, and both Roosevelts, alongside the Vanderbilts, Astors, Belmonts, and Rockefellers. A Boston newspaper editor of the era declared that if you went on a trip to New York and didn't travel the Fall River line, you simply hadn't gone at all. But the social fact the line understood better than its competitors was this: none of the amenities that attracted high society to the Priscilla or the Commonwealth required a passenger to be wealthy to use. The base fare was accessible to the middle class, and the middle class discovered, quickly, that the specific experience the boat provided, an entire overnight social world, structured by water and darkness, that delivered you to your destination without the exhaustion a train journey accumulated, had a value that had nothing to do with the silver on the table. A traveling salesman who shared the sound with the Vanderbilts on the Priscilla on a given Thursday night was not having a lesser experience of the night because his stateroom was smaller. He was having, at the rail, and in the dark water flowing past, the same specific interval that no train timetable could schedule. The line's officers often came from several generations of the same family, men who had run the identical route long enough to recognize, by sight, the same passengers returning crossing after crossing, the way a club's staff recognizes its members. This was not sentiment. It was the specific operational reality of a line that depended on regulars. What did it mean that a route serving everyone from the Vanderbilts to traveling salesmen had built, over 80 years of overnight crossings, a social institution that was genuinely classless in the specific experience it provided, not because it erased class, but because the dark water and the hull's rhythm treated everyone aboard in precisely the same way? The Harringtons' 1921 crossing sat comfortably near the top of the Fall River Line's long, distinguished history. The Priscilla and Commonwealth were at their peak. The overnight Sound crossing was still the preferred way for a large share of New York-Boston travelers, and the line's documented passenger traffic remained substantial. What George could not have known, standing at Pier 14 that Thursday evening with his family, was that the specific world he was showing Anne had roughly 16 years left to run. The fall came in two distinct stages. First, the Depression. From 1929 onward, the specific luxury that the Fall River Line had built its identity around, the a la carte dinner, the first-class stateroom, the orchestra in the saloon, became, for a significant portion of its regular middle-class passengers, less obviously justified against the cost of a train ticket that was cheaper and faster. Ridership declined, not because the boat had failed, but because the economic calculation had changed for the families who had kept it full. Second, labor unrest in the mid-1930s added operating costs the line's revenues could no longer absorb. The end was specific and documented. By the close of 1937, the four remaining passenger steamers, Priscilla, Plymouth, Providence, and Commonwealth, had been scrapped in Baltimore for a collective $88,000, a figure that bore no relationship to what they had been worth, to the thousands of passengers who had stood at their rails or eaten at their tables a decade earlier. The furnishings of the condemned vessels were auctioned off in public sales in November 1937, heavily attended. One documented account describes a man whose father had bought a stateroom key and a dinner plate at one of those auctions, objects small enough to carry home and keep for decades. What does it mean that the most durable memory of the Fall River Line's final season was not the last crossing, but the auction, the specific morning when what had been a way of making a journey between two cities became, instead, a collection of objects people carried home and kept? George Harrington took the New Haven Railroad's overnight to New York for the first time in the spring of 1938, the year after the Fall River Line's final season. The train left South Station a little before midnight, arrived in Grand Central Terminal by early morning, and was faster than the boat had been by roughly the margin the railroad had always advertised. George arrived in New York on schedule, in his seat, with his briefcase. What the train gave George Harrington: 3 fewer hours in transit, a seat that converted to a berth in a Pullman car, arrival at Grand Central rather than Pier 14, and a journey that required no tide, no schedule tied to a steamship company's operating decision, and no pre-dawn disembarkation at a Massachusetts wharf. What it did not give him: a night that was structured entirely around the specific fact of being on water. A darkness outside the window that was not the Connecticut suburbs, but the Long Island Sound moving. A saloon where the orchestra played for passengers who had nowhere else to be until Fall River, because they were, for the duration, on a boat on open water, and no other obligation applied. A rail on which to stand as Manhattan's roofline lost its detail against an evening sky, and where a daughter with a sketchbook could try to catch something the pencil was not, in the end, quite equipped to catch. George Harrington did not know, boarding the New Haven train at South Station in the spring of 1938, that this was what the boat had been giving him for the better part of 2 decades. He understood it with a specific, unhurried clarity the first time a younger colleague asked him, genuinely puzzled, what anyone had ever seen in the old Fall River night boat when the train was right there. George found he could not answer in a way that satisfied either of them. The train had given him New York faster. It had not given him the night. The rail on the Priscilla's deck had known what to do with a man standing at it as Manhattan receded. No railroad timetable had ever thought to ask. If this channel is going to keep documenting what the American excursion boat trip meant to the families who chose it, summer after summer, subscribe. There are more steamers, more overnight crossings, more evening cruises, and more crowded departure docks that were the best night of somebody's whole year, and were never described that way at the time because they didn't need to be. Even if you never sailed the Fall River line, what it gave a passenger, an entire night of dinner, music, and open water that arrived you in New York rested instead of exhausted, is something no highway, however fast, was ever built to provide. And if you have a memory of a night boat, a stateroom, a rail you stood at as a city receded, a crossing you still remember in specific physical detail, put it in the comments. Did your family ever sail the Fall River line or any Long Island Sound night boat? And do you remember waking up to find New York already waiting outside the porthole? Next time, the Puget Sound Mosquito Fleet, the small boats that carried an entire Washington state region to work every morning until a single bridge ended it all.